You know, we hear about regulations are bad, regulations are bad, regulations are bad. I've read and pulled up the article while Richard was talking. There's a group called the American Action Forum. It's probably the most scientific analytics of business relating to government that I've ever read. I mean, you really got to put your thinking cap on, and you got to really get in the middle of it. But they've concluded, and this is an interesting time to bring this up, they've concluded that regulatory burdens have grown in concert with what? Business consolidation to greater concentration. They examined 7 industries under which 0 represents a hypothetical market with an infinite number of firms of equal size. 10,000 represents a perfect monopoly with no competition. Once again, a very scientific, academic research. But one of the sectors the AAF reviewed, 2, banking and health insurance. Guess what they found out? Regulation was great for the banking industry because it consolidated. Regulation was great for the health insurance markets because it consolidated. The federal government, because legislation was introduced from a subcommittee, probably influenced by a healthcare lobbyist or a banking lobbyist, and it ends up working itself through the process in Washington, and we end up with more regulations, and then we end up with more consolidation. And I don't want to be some shadowy conspiracy theorist, but that's exactly the way this world works. And that's above most of our pay grades, because we see the person in the grocery store with the iPhone. That's not the problem. Once again, we complain about regulations, and I think our government officials laugh at the bank. Government regulations have been wonderful for the big banks. Government regulations have been wonderful for the big health insurance companies. So when you see everybody ranting and raving about government regulations, government regulations, government regulations, the big banks want government regulation. You know what they want to do? They want to regulate small banks out of business. The big health insurance companies, they love regulations, as long as the regulations are regulating the smaller health insurance companies out of the business. So there is a direct correlation between the regulatory burdens and business consolidation, which is greater concentration, which leads to quasi-monopolies, which leads to 3 or 4 banks, doing 80% of the financing in the world, and 5 or 6 or 7 insurance companies writing all the health insurance policies in the world. That's the crony capitalism I'm talking about. That's the distorting of markets. Now, we'll yell to the top of our lungs that regulations are bad. I'm a conservative, and regulations are bad. Not if you're a big bank. Not if you're a big health insurance company. You love regulations because you're equipped to deal with them, and the smaller companies are not. And that leads to consolidation. And of the 5, in fact, of the 5 of the 7 industries, the positive correlation coefficients, I told you this is kind of a thinking cap kind of thing, exceeded 0.07 on a scale of 1.0. 1.0 denotes perfect correlation. The banking industry, for example, saw a 700% increase in major rules from a period to 2000 to 2014, leading to the biggest increase in concentration in the history of American banking. Banking doesn't hate regulations. The big banks love regulations, as long as they regulate the small banks out of business. And in essence, that's what's happened. Maybe it's crony capitalism. I don't know. We were talking about that
something to consider
earlier. Do this for me. I've asked you to pull up a video. We're talking about crony capitalism a second ago. There's about a 5-minute PragerU. Dennis Prager has what he calls PragerU. And in that, he has a variety of videos, and they're fairly understandable. They're very simple. And there's one on what is crony capitalism. This is his version. And I've watched a lot of these things. Why Capitalism Works is another one. But I've asked Rev to pull up from PragerU on YouTube, what is crony capitalism?
Crony capitalism. What is it? Why is it so bad? To answer these questions, let's think about good old-fashioned capitalism. It is premised on the free exchange of goods or services between independent agents. Let's say I want to buy some cereal. Steve's Grocery is selling my brand for $4. Ted's Grocery has it for $5. I buy from Steve, which creates the most value for both me and him. Meanwhile, Ted now has an incentive to cut his costs so he can compete better. Replicate this kind of transaction billions of times a day, 365 days a year, and that is how our economy functions and grows, or at least how it's supposed to. Now, what about crony capitalism? Let's say it's the government that wants to buy some cereal. More specifically, the House of Representatives Committee for Cereal Acquisition is put in charge of the task. Steve still sells for $4, Ted for $5. I buy from Steve. He's the low price man. But the Committee for Cereal Acquisition buys from Ted. Why? Because Ted lobbied the committee. Because his corporate headquarters is in the chairman's district. Because he gave more campaign contributions. Because he promised a lobbying gig to an undecided committee member who plans to retire next year. That is how crony capitalism works. And it happens all throughout the government, from defense contracting to farm subsidies, clean energy programs, infrastructure spending, affordable housing, food stamps, Medicare, Obamacare, tax policy. You pretty much name it, crony capitalism is there. Capitalism is moral because it is premised on a voluntary exchange between independent parties who agree to the deal only because it creates value for everybody. Crony capitalism is immoral because one of the parties, the government, has been bought off. This creates three problems. First, it is unfair. Politicians are spending the public's money, but not for the public interest. Instead, they reward friends, supporters, or themselves. Our Constitution grants Congress the power to provide for the general welfare. Crony capitalism violates this sacred principle. Second, it is incredibly wasteful. In our cereal example, the government overpaid by going with Ted instead of Steve. That's obviously a waste of taxpayer money. In fact, it is really stealing from the taxpayer. Here's more waste. Ted had to spend money to lobby the government to get the contract, so he didn't get all that dollar out of the transaction. That's money that could have been spent making a better product or used in some other constructive way. Economists call this deadweight loss, and it can be substantial. Moreover, crony capitalism distorts the broader economy. In some industries like healthcare, student loans, home mortgages, and aerospace, the government is one of the biggest purchasers of goods or services. So its politicized decisions can have wide-ranging and detrimental effects. An entire industry can become, in effect, a client of the government. When that happens, its goal is not to build a better mousetrap, but to keep politicians happy. How much does crony capitalism cost society per year? It is hard to say precisely, but the number reaches into the tens of billions of dollars, maybe beyond. Third, it tempts politicians to break the law. Once politicians feel free to spend the public's money for their own political purposes, they are just a hop, skip, and a jump away from doing so to line their own pockets or pump up their campaign funds, or both. So what can we do? Our first task is to recognize that government must have limits. Of course, there has to be a national authority to set the parameters for society that establishes the rules of the game and enforces them. But when we expect the government to promote an industry, tinker with some sector of the economy, help some important voter group, we create the groundwork for crony capitalism and all the bad things that come with it: favoritism, waste, theft, and other forms of corruption. America's 7th president, Andrew Jackson, had a very useful perspective on this issue. There are no necessary evils in government, he said. Its evils exist only in its abuses. If it would confine itself to equal protection and, as heaven does its rains, shower its favors alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. Jackson had it right. A limited government confined to equal protection can't play favorites. Limited government. If getting rid of crony capitalism is the goal, it all starts there. I'm Jake Cost of the Weekly Standard for Prager University.